To reiterate, before this video starts, I want to show that the uncertainty principle can be defined really by two solid prerequisites. Number one, the uncertainty of whether or not two M fields will come relative to each other. Number two, the uncertainty of if two M fields are relative to each other, they can at any time cease to be relative to each other. So the uncertainty principles that are closely related to the entanglement are defined by those two prerequisites. So the only way that information on the surface of the manifolds and all recursive information can be known simultaneously is if both the mirror to the left and the mirror to the right are relative to each other or entangled. If this entanglement is lost, then no recursive information exists so as to observe and measure. We have the uncertainty of, first of all, if the two mirrors will come in relativity to each other. And of course, when they come into relativity to each other, we can observe and measure that they are known simultaneously as existing and that they're entangled due to the information being the same, i.e. per se, on both sides. So we have entanglement, which is a potential, and we have the potential of losing that entanglement. And we'll get into the double slit experiment, the collapsing of the wave, relativity of two reflective surfaces influencing the experiments, etc., etc. In essence, a human eye is a M field, a reflective vector that can potentially, if it becomes relative to other reflected objects or other reflected points in space, then recursion can be produced via the human eye. I haven't really wrapped my head completely around that, but it would seem to say that if the eye is the surface, going along with the descriptions I've made up to this point, then perhaps the brain is the interpretive aspects, and that there's some recursion. There's a recursion of information going on between the functionality of the surface of the eye, the functionality of the image that's produced on the retina, and how it's interpreted by the brain. Those are reflective recursive systems as well. So to observe and measure the virtual interiors or the matrices on both sides is to be able to mathematically measure or predict the volume of information on the surfaces themselves. Unfortunately, this information can't be observed. We can't see the surface of a black hole, but we can see and measure and study all the recursive aspects of the interior of the black hole, and ultimately we should, based upon the principles and the mathematical definitives that's being derived from the system, once we really study the relationship between two entangled recursions, as well be able to study and measure the volume of information in each recursive, then perhaps we can come up with an algorithm that could predict, if not state for certainty mathematically, based on the information in the recursive matrices, we can determine a mathematical sum for the volume of information spread across the screen as they are derived from each other. So at this point, all we can do is mathematically accurately infer the volume of information on the surface utilizing our measurements of the recursive functions on both sides. So I'm going to create an analogy here and discuss an analogy real quick and try to draw these principles into a more contracted framework till we can get a better view of the system. So we can deduce that the mirror to the left represents one beginning of a string. The mirror to the right also represents a beginning of a string. So the whole of the string, from the surfaces of the matrix, from the manifold surfaces through the recursion arrows of time opposing each other but attached, the whole system represents the whole of the string. And of course, again, we have to understand that the information between these 2 points of strings is part of the string itself, even though it's considered a fluid state, an open part. So we have the open distance between the 2 mirrors. Whatever information's there is implanted, projected to the strings, the closed points of the strings, and then furthermore, due to the entanglement relativity, the string is further extended, propagated. So the whole of the string due to the reflective principles in the relativistic system that I'm explaining, is defined as two ends of a string that are attached to each other by both the information on their Minkowski reflective surfaces and the information line within their respective interiors. And we're going to get into Lagrangian recursive lattices, more full-bodied descriptions of the matrices themselves as we continue. So it's the recursive functions occurring on both sides, side right, side left of the strings, that propagate the information from the surface and virtually stretch the whole of the string relationship. So in other words, if we know that there's two plane surfaces entangled and we have a virtual infinity here and a virtual infinity here, then we can show that by drawing those mirrors closer, the information in the virtual interiors will contract toward the surfaces that are coming close. So the information has extended virtually infinitely, and that information being reversed and drawn back toward the surfaces past event horizon shows that there is a stretching and contracting of the string. Again, we're speaking of virtual strings here. We're defining the strings under the confines of a reflective system. So this is very difficult, and it's a very abstract mathematical construct that I'm speaking of. Namely, though the two ends of the strings aren't really found out in the infinities, the two ends, actually we could say simultaneously the two ends or points of the string actually represent the two beginnings of the string. But if we really focus on the system, we can understand how that's the case. Though the two ends of the string represented by the manifolds are actually two separate points of strings that are connected only really via information, because they're not technically strictly attached in any way. It's the information that's on both and within both that shows that they are attached, that they're related to each other as 2 points of a string. So though the two ends of the strings are actually two surfaces that are separated, they're not really connected. One recursive function propagates the string infinitely one direction, and the other string propagates the other point manifold surface string infinitely propagates the string the other direction. So we have to note that these two ends cannot be described as a string with the endpoints at the ends of the strings way out into the virtual infinities. Rather, the two sides of the strings, maybe it's more appropriate to refer to these as two sides of strings versus ends of strings, because that terminology end kind of is not consistent with less abstract understanding of it. So the two sides of the string versus ends come before the recursive matrices. So therefore, they're depicted as in the center of the string. And all the information that's in the recursive matrices is centered with the center of the light ring on the surface. If we imagine a light ring on the surface, the center of that light ring is centered all the way down this perpendicular flow of information, the recursive flow. So all information, all light rings going from that recursively, the centers of all those light rings are also represented as the center here. So when all this recursive information contracts toward the past, toward the beginning, toward the event horizon, then all of it continues to be centered all the way down to the center. And of course, if the information, if the Lie algebraic lattice is coming this way, then we can predict with certainty that this means that the flow of information on the surface of that light ring is contracting. So as the smooth contraction happens on the surface, the recursive information as it contracts is more vibratory toward that surface. This smooth contracts smoothly. The recursive information, the closer it gets, the more vibratory its membranes get. So that's the point I'm trying to illustrate here. So being in the center of the string doesn't mean that these two surfaces exist within the interiors of the matrix. It just represents that the information on the surface is the central or the center relative to all the information in the recursive aspects of the dynamical system. In essence, we can say it's the recursion of information is where the dynamical aspects of the system lie versus the smooth, uniform contraction and expansion on the surface.